My husband did not say a single word to me for 10 full days, and the reason he started was because I had the nerve to speak my mind in front of his brother. That was it. That was the whole reason. And instead of talking to me like a grown man, he shut down completely and walked around our home like I was invisible. I cooked his food, slept beside him, existed in every room he was in, and he looked straight through me every single time. By day 8, I stopped waiting for him to come back. I made a decision, packed my things quietly, and left one note behind before I walked out that door. My name is Vivian, and I have been married to my husband David for 7 years. For most of those years, I held on to the belief that what we had was strong enough to survive anything. When things between us were good, they were genuinely good, and that kept me from looking too closely at the things that were not. David was the kind of man who showed up when it counted, remembered the details that mattered to me, and made me feel, in the early years especially, like I had chosen someone who truly saw me as a person worth choosing back. But there was another side to David that I learned slowly over time. The way you learn the layout of a dark room, by walking into the furniture enough times that you eventually memorize where everything hurts. Whenever David felt challenged, whenever I pushed back on something or held a position he disagreed with and refused to let it go, he would go silent. Not for an hour, not for an afternoon, but for days at a time, long and deliberate stretches of silence that filled every corner of our home and left me feeling like I was living with a stranger who wore my husband's face. The first time it happened was in our 2nd year of marriage, over a disagreement about money that should have taken 20 minutes to resolve and instead turned into 4 days of him acting like I did not exist. I remember cycling through every stage of confusion and anxiety until I eventually found my way to an apology, even though I was not entirely sure what I was apologizing for. And suddenly everything went back to normal like nothing had happened. I told myself it was just one difficult moment and that every marriage had those. But the truth is that was the moment the pattern was established, and I just did not recognize it yet. Over the years, the silences came back reliably, each one triggered by the same condition, which was me asserting myself in a way David did not like. Whenever I said no to something, whenever I stood firm on a position, whenever I dared to prioritize my own perspective over his comfort, the wall went up. And every single time, I had been the one to walk toward it. I had been the one to soften, to reach, to find some form of words that would unlock the door he had shut between us. I had been doing that for 7 years without ever stopping to ask myself what it was quietly doing to me. The argument that started these particular 10 days was so small that it almost embarrasses me to describe it. David's brother came over for dinner on a Saturday evening, and during the meal he made a dismissive comment about a decision David and I had made together regarding where we were planning to move. His tone was the kind that does not ask for a response so much as dares you to give one. And I gave one. Calmly, without raising my voice, I said that this was a decision David and I had worked through carefully together and that we were both comfortable with it. David's brother raised an eyebrow. David said nothing. After his brother left that night, David went to the bedroom and closed the door. I gave him time, and then I went in and sat down and told him I thought we should talk about what happened at the table. He looked at me with that expression I had come to know well over the years, not quite cold and not quite cruel, but living somewhere between the two, and he said that I had embarrassed him in front of his brother. I told him I had defended a decision we made together. He picked up his phone and turned away from me, and that was the last thing he said for 10 days. What was different this time was not the silence. It was me. In previous years, the silence would have triggered an immediate and familiar panic in me, the need to fix it, to chase him back, to apologize my way through the wall he had built. But this time, underneath all the frustration, there was something else sitting very quietly. A question I had been avoiding for a long time and could no longer find a way around. The question was simple. It was, why am I always the one who ends it? I did not have a good answer. And the longer I sat with the question, the more clearly I could see what had been true all along, but what I had been too afraid to look at directly. The silence was not David in pain. It was not David struggling to find his words. It was David in control, using the one tool that had consistently worked on me, knowing from years of experience that I would eventually come back to him and take the blame and restore the peace. It was not a reaction. It was a strategy. By day 6, I had stopped reaching. I stopped making gestures. I moved through our home doing what I needed to do, existing in my own space without performing any version of remorse for something I had not done wrong. And I watched to see what happened when I stopped giving him what the silence was designed to extract from me. What happened was that nothing changed on his end, and that stillness on his end told me more about the truth of our dynamic than anything he had ever said out loud. On day 7, I called my sister. On day 8, I started to think about what I was going to do next. I packed carefully and without rushing because I was not leaving in a panic, and I did not want it to look like I was. I took enough for 2 weeks, my clothes, my books, my laptop, and the small framed photograph I kept on my nightstand, the one of me and my sister laughing somewhere by the water, both of us looking completely unbothered by the world. I took that photo because I needed something to remind me of what my own face looked like when it belonged entirely to me. David was in the living room when I carried my bag to the front door. He looked at the bag and then he looked at me, and for the first time in 10 days, he actually opened his mouth. He asked what I was doing. Not with any softness in it, not with the voice of a man who was afraid of what the answer might be, but flatly, the way you ask someone why they moved furniture without checking with you first. I told him I was giving him the space he had clearly decided he needed. He did not say anything after that. I went to the kitchen and I wrote the note. I had been thinking about what to put in it since day 8, and in the end, I kept it simple because simple was the only thing that felt true. I wrote that 10 days of silence had told me more about our marriage than 7 years of conversation, and that I was not leaving because I was angry, but because I needed to exist somewhere I was not being punished for having a voice. I told him I hoped he would sit with that while I was gone. I folded the paper and left it next to his keys on the counter, picked up my bag, and walked out. The door closed behind me, and the sound of it was the quietest and most honest thing that had happened between us in years. My sister had the guest room ready before I even arrived, because she had heard something in my voice on the phone 2 days earlier, and she already understood what was coming. I stayed for nearly 2 weeks, and those days were not dramatic or filled with any kind of grand revelation. They were simply quiet in a way that felt like relief rather than punishment. I slept through the night. I ate what I actually wanted to eat. I sat with my own thoughts without having to calculate how my presence was landing on someone else, and I slowly remembered what it felt like to take up space without apology. David sent a message on the second day asking when I was coming home. There was no mention of the note. No acknowledgement of the 10 days, or what they meant, or what I might have been feeling through all of them. Just an expectation, direct and uncomplicated, that wherever I had gone I was still orbiting him and would return when the distance felt like enough of a statement. I did not reply for 3 days. When I did, I told him I would come back when we could have an honest conversation about what had been happening in our marriage, and I meant it as plainly as it sounds. He called that evening, and I let it ring. He called the following morning, and I let that one ring too. On the 3rd day he called and I answered, and the voice on the other end was one I genuinely had not heard before, uncertain in a way that his silence had never allowed him to be, stripped of the quiet authority that years of my compliance had built up around him. He sounded like a man who had finally understood that something he had taken completely for granted was no longer a guarantee, and that understanding had reached him in a place that nothing I had ever said directly had managed to reach. We talked for a long time that night. He did not have clean or fully formed words for everything, and neither did I. But we were both present in the conversation in a way we had not been in years, neither of us shutting down, neither of us retreating, both of us sitting inside the discomfort instead of reaching for the exit. He acknowledged that the silence had been a way of managing the situation. And I acknowledged that I had allowed it to work for so long that I had gradually become someone I no longer fully recognized, a woman who had learned to shrink at the first sign of his withdrawal and call that love. We were not repaired in that one conversation, and I will not pretend otherwise. But something that had been sealed shut for a very long time had opened, and that opening was where everything that came after became possible. I had spent 7 years afraid of David's silence. What I did not know, until I finally stopped running from it, was that the most powerful thing I ever did was become the woman he was afraid of losing. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, then you already know it was about much more than a note left on a kitchen counter. It was about the moment a woman stopped shrinking and started remembering who she was before she learned to make herself small. If this story hit something real for you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories like this one every single week, subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss one. I will see you in the next story.